as I go through these projections, it's not easy to do, and you've done them before. This is a tough year with a lot of movement around the NFL. And there's a lot of pitfalls you can run into with projections. There's a couple of players that we had talked about specifically where I sort of said this is the type of player that I'm not even going to pay attention to my projection for when it comes to sort of how I evaluate them. But we thought it might be fun as we got on to talk about sort of the whole process.
Exactly. And it's just so fun to listen to you talk about some of the things that you're running up against. And projections are just kind of crazy, right? There are so many people in the industry now who are very, very good at them. And it is helping ADP to be a little bit tighter than it was a few years ago. And yet at the same time, there are a lot of pitfalls. And as you mentioned, I have done some in the past. We've got some great tools at RotoViz if you want to go through and do your own. The projection machine will not only let you project all the teams, but it's got all kinds of research in there that you can use to get a sense of what these teams have done in the past, which, as you know, obviously is very, very useful. One of the things we're running into this year, obviously, we have a bunch of QBs change. We have a bunch of coaches change. Those things are going to change a lot of the trends. And yet, even when you know what a team has done in the past, there are still a lot of things you can fall into. And with these tools that we have at RotoViz, I did do projections for a while, and I felt like the projections ended up actually with excellent accuracy. And yet, to an extent, I felt like it actually made my game worse. Now, that's not to say don't look at projections. You do a great job with yours. You're going to do a show with Michael Leone. He is obviously just absolutely fantastic with them. I look at projections also from Dave Cabin, who does the projections for RotoViz. There are other people out there doing a great job. And yet, we also want to look beyond projections. And we've got some evergreen shows that people have been joined us recently and have been going back through the archives. They'll see some of the shows that we've done on talent and how that's going to drive opportunity. It's going to drive workload, and maybe don't be as focused on week one. But I also like to put these tools together with a variety of other ways of looking at how players would score. And so we have the range of outcomes tool up on the site, which is sort of situation agnostic. And you're thinking, well, if it's situation agnostic, then how does that really help you? Because the situation is so important. And yet it can just be so valuable to go in there and calibrate your expectations for what some of these players will do to give a little bit of a feel for regression and how that actually matches up with actual outcomes for players. One of the things that's hard to do when you're projecting people is not to have everybody sort of over projected just because of the way a season works and then how that translates into other seasons. So you can go in and look, and this has 25 percentile, 50 percentile, 75 percentile outcomes based on historical matches. And I like that. It's not that every historical match for a player is actually perfect for them or gives you insight into what they're going to do, but it does give you some context. We also have the Win the Flex tool, which gives you implied points based on ADP. That for me is just wildly helpful when I'm trying to think through what I want to do in drafts. You can also use the RotoViz screener to create, again, projections that are going to be sort of situation agnostic, but look at the player's statistical profile and give you a sense of what that actually means for how players tend to score the next year. You put all that together, and I think you're looking at it from different angles, and that gives you a sense of the range. But even with that, and what we always come back to is it's the scenarios and it's the contingencies that actually matter. When we condense those down to one number, we lose a lot of the information that we actually need. But when you go through and do the project yourself, like you're doing, then there is this element where you condense it down in the end, but you have so much information. And one of the things you were telling me about this that I thought was really cool is you've gotten through 10 teams. So you're about through a third of the league, and you've been labeling sort of the final projection for those teams either in green, yellow, or red based on how confident you are. And the split was a little bit in the direction of red. I don't think that that's necessarily bad. It's very fun. It creates some potential exploitable opportunities. And another thing you and I talk about a lot is this idea that you actually want to target teams and target players where there is a very wide range, in part because those are the easiest players for the community to get wrong. And that opens up an area where you could perhaps be right. But then part of that, and in some ways synonymous with that, is the idea that those players are also the ones where you could actually beat ADP. Whereas if you draft these guys in tighter ranges, yeah, I mean, they could get hurt, or a teammate could get hurt, and maybe that bumps them. But basically, you're just hoping they score what ADP suggests. That's not how you create a super team. And so just so many fun things to unpack here.
Yeah, and that's our show. You've unpacked them all. That was incredible. There was so much that you just said that I felt like we could have branched off a lot of different ways and done an hour on each. I guess I'll start with the red, yellow, green thing. Yeah, so one of the big things that I've learned over the last couple of years doing this is, well, number one, I've become more and more disillusioned with projections over the years. Anyone who reads Stealing Signals or follows my work knows that I'm pretty outspoken about it. But I still do them. And the biggest reason that I still do them is I use that as a huge research process, as you were just talking about. And I think that's very valuable. But one of the biggest issues for me is when I get to the end, or that I've really come to realize when I get to the end and I look at my final projection rankings, basically my quarterbacks and their projected points and my running backs and my receivers and my tight ends, is just recognizing the one that when you get to that point and you look at it from a league perspective, there are some that are coming from teams where I've made a lot of assumptions that I don't necessarily believe in. And there are others that come from situations that I feel pretty confident in. And so I think they have like a narrower band, but it's really comparing sort of apples to oranges with some of these projections where it's like, I could definitely see being really wrong on this. And you were just talking about that. And maybe those are the spots to target in some cases, right? So this year, as you mentioned, I decided to color code my teams to kind of to fall back on it, in part because there's been a lot of movement this year. And I kind of want to just keep in mind, like, look, I don't even know what I'm doing with this team. I just did Miami recently. I'm working on Baltimore right now. Baltimore is a team that, from a called pass perspective, they called passes on about 63% of plays last year. Their 2 prior seasons, they were sub 50%. Of all the teams I've done so far, none of them have had a sub 50% called pass rate. The actual, pass rate can be below 50%. The runs can be higher than the passes, in part because of QB scrambles and things like that. But the called pass rate has been higher than 50% and I've already done both Seattle and New England, who have been a couple of the more, willing to call run plays, run heavy type teams over the last few years at times. But no one else has had a single season sub 50% in terms of called pass rate. Baltimore has twice in the last 3 years, and both of the years leading into 2021, and then they're up at 63%, which is like a little bit on the high end in terms of a called pass rate. And just like sort of looking through that and being like, I haven't even finished my Baltimore projection, but I already turned them to a red team because I know whatever pass rate I set them at, I'm not confident in. Like I can regress that 63% a little bit and have it like around 61% or 60% and pretty close to last year. That doesn't feel like I'm regressing enough. But if I get it down even to like 58%, which is still a lot higher than 2019 and 2020, like a lot higher. And I don't think they're going to be a sub 50% team again, right? But even if I have it in the high 50s, in the 57% range, like I said, when you add in Lamar Jackson scramble rate, you come up with a projection where they're like pretty close to 50-50 in terms of runs and passes. You're talking about cutting 100 pass attempts off of their total from last year. They also ran the most plays in the NFL last year. And so we've talked a lot about how they might throw fewer times this year. If you regress their total play volume at all, if you regress their pass rate at all, you're going to find yourself looking at them throwing 100 fewer passes pretty quick. And so it is a team like that where I'm like, I don't want to be completely out on every Raven because there's a possibility they maintain that and they've had an organizational shift towards the pass, right? But I just don't feel comfortable. So the green teams are, look, I feel this is the most likely scenario, and I feel like it's actually a pretty likely one. Maybe it's 30% likely or 40%. No one scenario obviously is going to be, 70% likely. But this scenario or something very closely resembling it or somewhat closely resembling it, barring injury and those types of things, I feel like it's like maybe even like a 30% or a 40% likely scenario. I'm going to call that green. I just did that for the Bills. The Bills feel pretty comfortable with what they are. Yellow, I'm thinking I feel comfortable about this being the most likely scenario. But I think there's a lot of other ones that you can make good cases for. Maybe it's a 15% most likely or 20% most likely, but there's a lot of other ones, other scenarios or key differences that could happen with their team volume, with their, opportunity splits in terms of target share and rush attempts and things that I would think of as, 10% likely scenarios, what have you, right? I'm just sort of, this is how I'm thinking through it. The reds are the ones where I'm like, I don't even know if this is the most likely scenario. You could convince me multiple assumptions that I made here are wrong. And that's, or very important, at least one very important assumption. That's, again, going to the Ravens. I think their pass rate could be anywhere from 10 different percentage points, basically. It could be down low, close to 50% again, because they did go out and draft 2 tight ends. They did trade away their wide receiver 1. They haven't really added anyone else besides Rashod Bateman. We've all been kind of saying maybe Julio Jones winds up there or somebody does, but this looks like a team that's going back to, hey, we want to play 2-3 tight end football. And maybe we want to be run heavy again. Maybe we think last year was a problem. At the same time, there was a lot of positive that came from their passing. And I think that they are a smart organization and recognize some things. And so, I mean, I could see them being up over 60% pass rate again. I could see them being in the low 50s or approaching those 2019 and 2020 seasons where they were sub 50%. That's a huge range that would massively impact the projections for all of the receivers in terms of their target rates and all of the rush numbers for the running backs. And so I'm immediately making the Ravens, a red team where I'm like, I'm going to wind up with an assumption that I'm not confident in. I'm going to pick a number, probably try to split the difference, but I'm not going to be confident in it.
How much do you feel like the talent on the teams, maybe especially in these situations where we're not confident, because there are dynamics that could push them to a pretty wide range? How do you feel like that will play out? One of the things that's kind of interesting with the Ravens is that they have this very wide range in terms of what the pass rate could be. And yet at the same time, it feels like one of the offenses that maybe is the most set in place in terms of who the stars are and who's going to be touching the ball within the context of whether or not it's run or pass, and that they should be explosive either way. And that you have Lamar Jackson, who is this elite rushing quarterback, but also a good vertical passer. And you have someone, Rashod Bateman, who played poorly last season. Rookies can go either direction. Blair's about to release some more. Another fantastic entry in his Wrong Read series. Again, kind of talking about how the efficiency for rookie receivers is actually a pretty strong signal. And Bateman wasn't in that group. That's, I think, a little bit concerning, but someone who was a first-round pick, had great numbers at Minnesota, is actually much more athletic, I think, than people realize. And so you have that vertical element. He had a season in college where he was over 20 yards per reception. If you look at some of the regression trees for prospect evaluation in the past, you'll see that, someone up over 17%, that tends to put you in an area where minimal other positive signs, you actually have a pretty good chance of developing into an above average NFL player. So you have this vertical threat, a receiver with a vertical passing QB. You have J.K. Dobbins coming back, who put up extraordinarily good peripherals. You can check those out in the Advanced Stat Explorer. As a rookie, he gets hurt. He's coming back. We know that his injury, too, is something that kind of throws this projection into the red. But when he's there and when he's ready, he's going to be one of the 3 or 4 most dynamic backs in the NFL. Now, because he's probably not going to catch very many passes, that's still tricky for fantasy, which is one of the reasons, in addition to the injury, that he's not particularly expensive. But the talent obviously is there. And then you have Mark Andrews, who probably now is the best tight end in the NFL. And so we can kind of make some assumptions on how they'll play within the context of a team that could pass at very different rates. But it seems like those are going to be the guys, and the scoring is going to flow through them. When you looked at some of these scenarios, how does that kind of manifest itself for the Ravens, but then also maybe contrast for us the Ravens and another red team that maybe has some different issues?
Yeah, that's great. That's one of the other things you said earlier that I think we could have talked about for a super long time, but you said that so well. So the Ravens, I would say, if you could tell me what their pass rate is going to be, I'd probably make them a green team because of all the things you just said. And I feel pretty confident projecting Mark Andrews for his share, right? And projecting Rashod Bateman just because I think that he's pretty clearly going to be ahead of the other receivers that are there, even though there are some concerns with year one for Bateman's targets per out run weren't fantastic either. But you have to like where he's at. Dobbins, assuming health for being a huge part of that, and sort of the hierarchy at each position, right? Who's coming next? Wide receivers are a little trickier. Who's the second best receiver? But Gus Edwards is going to factor in behind Dobbins if healthy, right? And they brought in Mike Davis. They have Tyler Beatty. It's going to be some type of a shift. I can project that pretty easily. All of that to me feels very green. And so for some teams, it's the team level stuff that is red, and then the player level stuff feels a lot more green. I feel comfortable projecting Lamar Jackson's rush rate at this point. It's actually been pretty darn consistent. It's come down a little bit as he's gotten a little older, but the range he's going to be in, the type of rush volume he's going to have in terms of both, design runs, scrambles, all of those things. And so the whole rest of it, allocating all of the rushes and the passes and everything is relatively easy for them if you get the team volume right. There's other teams where you feel pretty confident about maybe their team volume. I used Arizona as a yellow team. Feel pretty comfortable they're going to be pretty up tempo. They've played it a similar way the last couple of years. Kyler scrambles are going to keep their pass volume down a little bit. But like allocating the work there was tough. It was tough because James Conner looks like he's going to be getting tons of work at running back. That's a little bit easier in a projection sense. But there is some concern about how healthy he's not always been fully healthy. I'm a little concerned at his age that he can stay, he's probably how you address that in a projection. An older running back is up for debate. I tend to just project the guy for full health basically, and then keep it in mind, the health stuff after the fact. But then at receiver, you have Hopkins on suspension. And so what does that mean for the opportunity it creates for Rondale Moore and Trey McBride early in the year and those types of guys? Do they earn roles that then sustain throughout the season? There's a lot of ways you can see the receiver and pass catcher group shift. And so for them, team level volume feels pretty comfortable. How do I project the target shares? That's actually a little tougher. I can see scenarios where a few of these guys step up early and become key pieces for them and really push like an AJ Green completely out when DeAndre Hopkins comes back, because it's just so clear that, Rondale Moore has to be on the field or Trey McBride has to be on the field. But the other red team that fits this is Miami, which is one of these teams where, okay, we added Tyreek Hill. What do we do now? Right. And so you talked about the talent. And then there's this push and pull with what do we expect from the coaches and things. We have Mike McDaniel coming over. A lot of assumption that he's going to bring over sort of a San Francisco type offense. Well, San Francisco tends to be pretty run heavy in the ways that they call plays. Miami, the last few years themselves, have had a positive pass rate over expected. Is McDaniel going to be more pass heavy in this offense? Because the note that I wrote for the team stuff was real tough team overall, not confident in their touchdown total, their usage rates, their efficiency, obviously wide uncertainty bars. And then I wrote pass rate is tough. San Francisco historically run heavy. This roster is aligned to pass. And that's the key, right? Like Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle are your best players. And that's what I always try and keep in mind. Like a good coach is going to make sure to get those guys the ball. And I have them, running a decent amount as well, combining for 25 carries, which is kind of a lot for a team's top two receivers. It's not, what Deebo Samuel did last year or anything, but it's a good chunk of rush attempts. I have them, seeing pretty hefty target percentages because I'm expecting designed passes to them. I don't have their ADOTs super high because I think they're going to get the ball in Tyreek's hands closer to the line of scrimmage. Waddle's wasn't very high last year anyway. I have Gesicki there, and then you look at the running backs and you're also going, I don't know. Chase Edmonds is going to have his role, but what does it mean? What do they get out of Raheem Mostert? What does Sony Michel do? Is Myles Gaskin, completely dead as sort of the fourth running back in your projection? And so this was a team where I do think a lot about what you said, and that's something we've talked about a lot over the years, that the talent is going to shift the trend somewhat. And so part of me, when I start these, I can look at the past trends, but a lot of times with a team like Miami, I'm going, I don't look at their past trends. I'm going to start this from scratch. And I'm going to say, we have a whole new offensive system coming. We also have a whole new shift in terms of what their talent looks like, right? All new running backs. Tyreek Hill is now your wide receiver one. I'm kind of throwing up air quotes because Waddle might be as well. Waddle was there, but Tyreek Hill and Waddle together is different than Waddle and Devontae Parker or whoever. Cedric Wilson is there as well. You still have Gesicki, you still have Waddle. That's about it, really, in terms of how this offense looked last year. At times, it was only Waddle and Gesicki getting the targets. We loved that on one of our main event teams that we talked a lot about last year. That was fantastic with Pat and Pete. But this year, they have Tyreek Hill there now. They have some other things, and so I'm not really looking at Waddle's target share last year as much. I mean, I'm looking at it from the perspective that I know that he's good, or I have a strong indication that he's good. But like when I build out this projection for this team, I'm going, okay, where's the talent and how do I think that this offense should run, basically? Because it's almost assuming coaching competence, which can get you in trouble as well. So it's a tricky team when you look at a team like Miami.
And as you were kind of going through that, it reminded me of a team that Kyle Shanahan was an offensive coordinator for in Houston, where Matt Schaub, Andre Johnson, I believe Schaub was up there, not the NFL leader, but toward the very top in terms of passing yards. And so again, a situation where if the talent really dictates that you attack in a certain way, that offense can be deployed in a way that unlocks that, as opposed to tries to enforce it through those running backs who, those are solid running backs. And I've been drafting a lot of Sony Michel late for the very reason that, he seems set up nicely to do, in weeks 14 through 17, more or less what he did last year in the fantasy playoffs. And so I think that you want to create exposure to that. And at the same time, it's not really the way we would expect Miami to go. When you're thinking of some of these teams too, and New England was another team that you put in this difficult to project range. They have a QB taking that second year step. We talk a lot about wide receivers and the second year leap, but it's also something that is the case for quarterbacks. It's interesting right now because I'm in a couple of dynasty startups where the fact that, and you can pull up the RotoViz Triflex Dynasty ADP in our tools and kind of look at where these guys are. And we talked about how it can give you some critical information for redraft. The fact that Zach Wilson is so expensive now that Garrett Wilson is also there along with Elijah Moore, and drafters think, okay, well, he's got these key weapons. Mac Jones also going relatively early, but not as early, which in some ways is startling because he's in this very strong organization, even though they've got some squirrely stuff going on in terms of how they may run their offense from a coaching perspective this year. Very strong organization, probably the best of the rookie quarterbacks last year. Someone who looks like he could be a long-term, say, Matt Ryan or Kirk Cousins. If you're drafting in a startup right now and you could get Kirk Cousins or Matt Ryan in their early 20s, you'd have this asset that would allow you to dominate the superflex spot, maybe not your QB1, but the superflex spot for a decade, right? And they've added Devontae Parker. They've added Tyquan Thornton. So how do you feel like that type of thing will manifest where you have some young players and you have this very now crowded wide receiver room where it's almost the opposite from Miami, where they have some true stars? It feels like almost the Patriots' problem is just that they have a bunch of guys. Mm-hmm. And it would have just, at some point along the way, it would have made sense for them to actually add above average players as opposed to continually stockpiling below average players. And I think Thornton adds this interesting piece now because you have a 4-2 guy, and it can require some quarterback play. And that'll be one of the interesting things in Miami is to see just how good Tyreek Hill is. He's strongly suggested on his podcast, which he should. You should, on your own podcast, you should be saying, I'm a great wide receiver. But he suggested he's going to be good with Tua, right? Some of these guys who run in the 4-2s, that's one of the reasons why then I have to admit that I got caught up watching some Rondell Moore highlights the other day, and he's going to be good.
You're back in. You're back in. How can you not be?
He's going to be good. Tyquan Thornton can get by the defenders. He gives Mac Jones that deep element. But we have Thornton, we have Parker, we have Jacoby Myers. those probably kind of the frontline guys, but then we also have Nelson Aguilar and Kendrick Bourne behind them. We have multiple tight ends. We have multiple running backs. In many cases, one of the things that we're looking for when we actually draft is not so much how the players are projected to play, but situations in which you're actually getting a little bit of a discount on the player where they're going. So you have them a little bit above ADP, but there's also a potential injury situation. And again, when we mention this, we're rooting for everyone to stay healthy. But the fact of the matter is that, I mean, the NFL is a brutal game and a ton of injuries are going to happen, not just one or two, and not just like one, league altering, fantasy altering injury, but a ton are going to happen. If you're getting a guy a little bit of a discount and then one of his teammates get injured and the offense is still strong enough, then he's actually going to destroy ADP. A team like the New England Patriots probably not built that way because an injury there and you're still just in the same boat. They've got a lot of guys.
Yeah, that sounded like Miami, right? If Tyreek goes down, Waddle can crush. And you're not getting a huge discount necessarily on Tyreek or Waddle, and vice versa. It's true. And if those guys just are the guy, as opposed to trying to coexist a little, you definitely feel very good taking them where they're going right now. And we talk about that. We talk about looking for those crowded receiving rooms and those situations where there's contingency upside as well. The Miami might not be the best example, like I said, because they are both pretty expensive. And so, it's best when the player might be able to hit their value at where they're being drafted or even exceed it without an injury. And then there's this sort of baked in upside, which sort of is the Tyler Boyd point always, or has been since, at least since last year. But it feels like always it was the Jarvis Landry point, I guess, for a lot of years where, Boyd is just that guy for me right now in my head, where if something were to happen to Chase or Higgins, I think Boyd is still very good and still in his prime and could be a lot better. But he can also still be good enough if they stay healthy.
Well, and you hate to even say this out loud, but Brandon Ayuk, I mean, think about what he could do if one of those other two guys goes down.
Yeah, that's a great one. But yeah, the reason I put New England, I made them a yellow team, but part of it was, look, Josh McDaniels is gone now, and we don't really know what that's going to mean. We don't really know what's going to mean for who's going to call their plays. I think latest we heard was going to be Matt Patricia, a defensive coordinator and, former defensive coach. But I said that I had them running a few more plays. I have them throwing a bit more in the last couple of years because I just think that's probably the natural progression. With Mac Jones taking over, certainly, throwing more than 2020 when they had Cam Newton for most of the year and their pass rate was very, very low. But so I'm projecting them to throw a little more and run a few more plays. That seems fairly minor, but I do feel like that could be, that seems like an easy enough projection, but I do feel like that could be pretty far off. They could be even run heavier. We don't know. We don't know how the new coach tree under Belichick is going to, operate. Obviously, Belichick's still going to have his hands in everything, but their offense has shifted a lot over the years. We can say that. And then you talked about how different each position, could go, right? You have Harris and Stevenson and Pierre Strong at running back, and whether James White's healthy. That's kind of just throwing up my hands and just sort of doing it like by ADP, giving Harris the lead, the lead share, Stevenson the next share, and Strong the next share, and giving White some receiving. And receiving, you expect that I projected Jacoby Myers for 150 targets because that's the easy answer. When you were forgetting about him, as you talked about all the guys,
I mentioned three players there. Three good wide receivers: Thornton, Parker, and Myers.
You were talking about all of the guys that aren't very good on this team. Just forgot about Jacoby Myers. Obviously, I'll let you have that. But
when Thornton has 3 touchdowns in his first game and Myers is like running into the end zone to congratulate him, it's going to be such a nice moment.
I get points for that. Point. I'm in a point per high five league. No, I'm not. But yes, you're right about the receivers, and then even the tight ends. Like there's been like little whispers here and there, or I don't know, at least suggestions, maybe just more in the fantasy industry that, the Patriots GM Bill Belichick signed Jonnu Smith to a huge deal and maybe wasn't thrilled that offensive coordinator Josh McDaniels, from a head coaching perspective, that his offensive coordinator last year wasn't utilizing this player as well as he maybe could have, and that Jonnu Smith could be a bigger piece of the offense. I kind of buy into that. I think he's an interesting player. We've talked about him a little
I
bit.
say it from time to time, and I have no sources. So
Okay, maybe I got
anybody who's getting it from me,
it's probably from you.
just conjecture.
we'll just squash that rumor right now. But I kind of like the idea of projecting Jonnu Smith to do a little more. He wasn't exactly bad last year, and it was a little bizarre. And that would probably be bad for Hunter Henry, if Jonnu's actually involved. So it's a team where from a positional allocation perspective, it's really tough. And from the team level stuff, it's tough. But I like the way you're kind of putting it in terms of there might not be a lot of upside here anyway.